Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, looks like we have a majority of people online, so we'll go.
Ash, I think you muted yourself on accident.
Unmute myself here. All right, thanks everyone for joining us. We're about to get started here to have a session on EarthEx 2020 to learn about how you guys can participate this fall. We have a presentation, a full hour's worth by John Heltzel, the Director of Resilience Planning at the IS Council, and he oversees the execution of their annual EarthEx 2020 exercise. He's going to speak about in a moment. John's experience with emergency preparedness reaches far and wide. Before working with the IS Council, he's had a 33-year military career where he commanded at the battery, battalion, and regimental levels. He served as the commander and assistant adjutant general of Kentucky's Joint Force Headquarters, where he directed the training of the Kentucky National Guard in direct support of their homeland and global security mission. He has served as the Chief Information Officer for the Kentucky National Guard and Department of Military Affairs. In 2008, the governor of Kentucky appointed him to lead the Kentucky Division of Emergency Management. And in addition to all of this, he has served on a variety of emergency management boards and associations focused on response planning and exercise conduct, regularly working with FEMA. We will take questions for him at the end of the presentation, but if you have anything you would like to ask throughout the presentation, feel free to put it in the chat box and we'll get to it at the end. So without further ado, John, feel free to take it away.
Hey, thanks, Ashton. I appreciate that, and I apologize for you all having to listen to my bio. Basically, all I said was I'm an old guy that's been doing this for a while. I am the Director of Resilience Planning for the Electric Infrastructure Security Council. The council is a 501c3 that's focused on energy resilience, specifically the electric grid resilience efforts and the resilience of the communities that are supported by electricity. We've been in this business for over a decade, but we've really in the last several years have added this particular arrow in our quiver, which is the EarthEx exercise. This is year 4. It's the end of our first story arc, and this year's exercise is against some significant man-made threats. Last year's exercise, very large, was based against a regional, naturally occurring threat. In last year's exercise, we saw play in 41 countries and over 12,000 participants. So EarthEx is very large. It is international. It's distributed, but it's very easy to get into the play and use it for your own use. And we'll talk about that today. That's really the purpose of all this. So let's get into the briefing. There we go. I love this slide. A lot of what the council talks about is we call black sky events. And the reason they're called black sky events is because they are things that can create a long duration power outage. That long duration power outage may be the single greatest threat to mankind that we can think about. And that's not to take anything away from the current COVID disaster, but a long duration power outage that brought down the grid would have so many cascading failure points that it would be hard to recover from. And so the reason that the council works on these areas is to ensure that that doesn't happen. There are a number of black sky threats, the natural kinds such as earthquake, terrestrial weather, solar weather, and then of course we've got human-made threats like EMP, cyber, and that one that we know more about, the direct physical attack, which is also known as war. But if we stop for a second and look at this slide, think back about the black sky. When man first started to have consciousness on this planet, all the skies were black skies. And shortly after that, we began building grid systems. And our grid systems started by following animal paths. And animal paths took us to waterways, and waterways took us to other places. And basically, that was the two-way directional travel, was using the existing waterways. When we took to the sea, we had to have a system of navigation. And that was one of the first uses of technology that was brought on board to help man conquer his surroundings. And over time, we've taken those simple beginnings and built them and built them and built them until about 150 years ago, we actually started on a new grid system. We built the transportation networks of roads up and waterways, but then we started moving into communications. And it wasn't long after we got into simple communications, basically the telegraph, and that evolved into the party telephone line system. That somewhere around there, we invented some additional capabilities that allowed us to not only communicate, but to manage information in a new way. And that's the computer age, the beginning of the computer age. And once we had large scale computers working, DARPA funded a project to establish what was the beginning of the internet. And as the internet came about, satellite communications evolved at the same time. And so in this period, what happened was our ability to communicate and move information became increasingly more affordable because it became more and more in the hands of businesses first, and then the population in general. And we see that trend continue today, and it goes and it goes and it goes. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is really linchpinning on this issue of these new grids that are out there that underpin everything we talk about. But they all start back with this original black sky issue. So when we talk about these grids, we coined a term called the metagrid. And what the metagrid is, in simple terms, it's the grid of grids. So if you think about this, you know that today's independent sectors, each one operating in its own area, are beginning to more and more require the coordination with other sectors. If you look at what happened to us just recently in COVID, one of the major issues we had was the supply chain. One of the things I want to leave you with today is the supply chain is king. Everything we do in today's world basically involves coordination, collaboration, and some use of the supply chain. And these sectors that we're talking about, these independent sectors, are growing together, ever increasing speed, more and more complex and hyper connected, to the point now where if you think about the matrix on the right-hand side of this slide, each one of those dots is an organization, and each one of those dots represents the interconnected systems that build the capability of that organization. What we found through analysis and what a lot of academic work is being done on right now is that there are critical systemic gaps within our capabilities. We need to begin thinking about tools and capabilities that are self-evolving and self-healing, so that when a portion of the network fails, the network knows how to route around that failure point. As recently as 2 weeks ago, when one of our major communications companies in the United States had a bad experience with a pushed patch, brought down basically internet communications, satellite communications, terrestrial communications, and cellular communications for hours. And that was just one experience with a bad patch push. So we've got to start thinking about what can we do? How can we increase the resilience of these systems and make them become more and more of a tool? But one of the things we need to think about for these tools to become effective, they have got to become profitable business tools. That's the model that we live in. The idea that government at any level can solve this problem and inflict its will or force its will on other elements is just not the way the world works today. We live in an economic world that's built on the ability to move product and services. And when we find something that works for the business community, it rapidly gets adopted and implemented. Little problem here. There we go. So one of the things I want to talk about today is electromagnetic pulse. And I've added these slides in for this audience because some of you all probably have not been exposed to this. I'm an old guy. I grew up in the Cold War, and we were very concerned with EMP. But EMP is a complex electrical signal that is used by the Earth for all kinds of things. But when it happens in an uncontrolled manner, it has the ability to impact all our networks and our electrical systems in ways that, to be honest, are not fully tested or mitigated against right now. How do we know about this? Because we actually began doing tests after the first nuclear rounds were unleashed. And then we continued that testing through the 50s and the 60s. And some of the last ones that were done there were both in Russia and in the US in the 60s. One of the ones you can Google is the Starfish project. One of the gentlemen on my planning team for EarthEx actually has been to the island that was impacted during Starfish, and he can tell you all kinds of interesting story about what it's like to be on an island that was attacked in that manner. But the sources of electromagnetic pulse can come from a couple of different places. The one we're concerned with is a high altitude nuclear detonation. This is the threat vector that we talk about often. A high altitude nuclear detonation has the ability to send the energy yield and the gamma ray output across a broad region of the country or the world. And at that point, it's really unknown exactly how many systems will survive. We regularly get questions about, well, what will happen to this device or that device or another device? It's very hard to answer that question because devices basically have gone through a period where some have gotten amazingly more protected and others have gotten less protected. So the bottom line is we continue from the council standpoint to work with our friends in the military and in the scientific arena. And we're actually going to publish a paper in about 2 months on EMP. And if you'll stay in contact with us, we'll make sure you all have access to it. The other source, though, that's very concerning besides high altitude nuclear detonation is this IEMI ability. And you may think that's something out of an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie back in the 80s, but it's not. There are actually devices, suitcase-sized devices, that have the ability to produce an electromagnetic field in a local environment to completely bring down elements of either a grid or a specific device or an organization. So it's not science fiction, it's real world. So if you want a little bit more to know about the EMP threat, if you want to impress your friends, try to keep this graph in mind. There are basically 3 wave pulses that we are concerned with. The E1, which is ultra fast, narrow pulse, E2, much slower, and then E3, which is even slower, but has a different kind of an impact than E1. E1 is the one that basically will fry out a lot of our electronics. That's the one we're concerned with. And if you look at the graph that's on the left-hand side of the page, something to keep in the back of your mind, the numbers across the bottom are in negative seconds. So not until you go over to 10 to the 0 is do you finally hit a second. So these things, when we talk about ultra fast, that's how quickly they happen. There is no preparedness. There's no, oh, it's going to happen, get ready. You're either protected or you're not protected. And if you're protected, you should be able to continue operations or become able to go back into operations more quickly. If you're unprotected, the odds are your equipment is going to be fried. And that's something that causes a black sky event. Some of the things, just for a little more background on this, it's not the purpose of the brief today, but I thought you'd enjoy hearing a little bit more about it. What we're concerned with on the electrical side is the digital relays that are prevalent across the entire electrical grid. They're basically everywhere. When they're put in place to make sure that the grid is manageable and that it breaks at the appropriate time if it needs to keep it from overloading. When you have an EMP event, the relays, if they're not protected, will fry almost instantaneously. And that will cause a cascading event, which is what we always want to try to avoid. This is an example of a cascading event. The 2003 Northeast blackout was not caused by EMP, but it was caused by relay misoperation. And so basically human intervention did not happen when it should have. And one relay tripped another relay, and caused a cascading failure that basically left most of what you see in this picture in the dark. That's what we're all trying to work to prevent. You can imagine they were able to restore the 2003 Northeast blackout in a reasonable amount of time. Now, if you were in it, you didn't think it was reasonable, but from the outside, it seemed like it went pretty well. In a true black sky event where you lose portions of the capability and you cannot restore for possibly weeks to months, you have a number of cascading consequences that we'll talk a little bit about as we go forward. But the bottom line that we realize that we can't afford is the idea of trying to evacuate large areas of the country. The EIS Council worked with MIT about 2 years ago and did a study of the Northeast corridor and basically determined from a population density issue, you simply cannot evacuate from those areas. There's no physical way to do it in a short amount of time. So from an emergency management planning standpoint, doing everything we can to protect the grid, make the grid more resilient, and the other systems that need to be able to operate to restore the grid is paramount for what we do. So one last slide on this, the impacts to the power system. If you notice that transformer in that picture, you may have seen these before in your travels, and you think, well, that's a whole lot of devices. It's not really, it's a large transformer. These transformers are not sitting on the shelf waiting for somebody to order them. They have to be manufactured. If that transformer gets fried, while there may be some in America that can be swapped out quickly, if you have a number of these go out, they have to go into a manufacturing cycle. And that manufacturing cycle is measured in months to years. So it's not something that if we lose a lot of these, we have a way to come back. Again, these large transformers, they're vulnerable to the E3 issue. So it's one of those things that, again, the reason we're in this business is to try to make sure that this doesn't happen. I'm going to slow down on this slide just a second so your eyes can kind of try to follow it. But what really happens, you've heard me use the term cascading consequences, and it's bannered about quite a bit, but very few people have actually done the real study to find out what would trip if we lost power. Now, we had a good example of it in Katrina, but in Katrina, the impacted area was relatively small. It was huge if you were there, but it was relatively small geographically speaking, and the grid beyond the impact area was not impacted. So once we were able to restore distribution and some transmission capability, we were able to get the power back up fairly quickly. Sandy is another example, but Sandy lasted a little bit longer in a smaller area. But Sandy gave us a really great example of how these other things trip. So if you lose electrical ability, what happens is the systems that actually provide the supply chain for the electrical capability are negatively impacted. So there's the ability to move oil and natural gas goes away because they count on electricity for pressurization and actually drying out the natural gas. You also lose the ability for signaling. So you think about transportation. If you've ever been stuck in a traffic jam when people don't remember who gets to go when the lights don't work, imagine that in DC. Imagine that in Los Angeles. Imagine that in any major urban area. Transportation has become a nightmare. In some cases, emergency services would be impacted, especially if it goes on beyond the 48-hour timeline. Most emergency services locations have a backup generator. We'll talk about that in a minute, but not all do. And most do not have an extensive availability of backup fuel. So again, fuel is impacted because we can't get it to the locations that have backup generators. So unfortunately, some of the studies we've done say about 72 hours of generator capability is about the max we can expect to have out of a general support role. Some hospitals have invested quite a bit, which is a critical component. But what gets us if a hospital is impacted, they have a generator, but what they don't have is their own ability to move water. So hospitals live and breathe on the ability not only to get potable water, but to manage wastewater. And when wastewater can't move, you have to shut the hospital down for the most part. And then obviously, one of the ones that caught our attention, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is the impact of the banking and finance community. We turn on credit. We turn on the availability of funds. We turn on those financial institutions knowing that they're in agreement on certain actions that have to be taken. And when they can no longer communicate, all that work gets shut down. I had a fortunate opportunity about a year ago to go to London and to Glasgow and do a Black Sky workshop for those two countries. And was it very interesting because the gentleman from the Bank of London and the gentleman from the Bank of Scotland, both when we were going through the issues, said that if they lose communications, they're done. And I said, well, of course, you guys are the Royal Bank of, and you've got a lot of backup capability. And they quite candidly admitted, no, they don't. They do have some backup comm capability, but nothing that would survive in the case that the actual terrestrial networks went down. So if you think about that, the ability to not move funds at that level is paramount and scary, but then the ability and the impact to our citizens if they can't get to a debit card reader to get funds or an ATM. So just think about that. And on the right-hand side, water, wastewater we talked about. Imagine food distribution systems going offline. If you think about New York City as just an example, there's not a lot of food grown in New York City. Nearly 100% of all the food that supports that huge population on the island of Manhattan all comes over the bridges at night. So you're impacting not only the transportation network, but the food distribution network. Obviously, refrigeration is a huge issue. We talked about healthcare facilities, and I talked a little bit about fuel production. What I want you to leave this slide with is we are a tightly interconnected world today that is vitally dependent on cross-sector capabilities, but most are undependent by electricity. Not all, but most. So I want to talk just a little bit about resilience, because with this group, one of the reasons we're so happy to work with the regulatory community is we think you're the key to solving some of these current issues we're dealing with. In fact, our very first Black Sky exercise was done for the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission by the chairman, Gladys Brown Dutrell, great friend of ours, been on many of our panels. And our second Black Sky workshop was in New Jersey, hosted by Lynn Constantini, who now works for NARUC. We believe you guys are key to solving some of these overall resilience issues that have to be incentivized to move forward. But you can see 6 of the major threats across the top. Down on the left-hand side, you can see that there are at least 16 critical sectors that need to be involved. There's actually a few more beyond what DHS has talked about. They come in the terms of some of the expanded units and expanded efforts that need to be made. But then we think about, well, in all these different sectors against these different threats, there are obviously work that needs to be done, both in preparedness, but also mitigation, which is a huge thing in the FEMA world. And unfortunately, sometimes we don't see it manifested as much as we need to in some of the critical infrastructure areas. Some states are moving forward, though, with things like backup power. And then the response, to be honest, we have one of the best response teams in the world, if not the absolute best. FEMA does a great job for the staffing that they've got, and they're able to head off most results before they turn tragic. But if you think about one thing that we're in right now, for the first time in our country's history, we actually have 54 declarations of emergency, 54 presidential declarations. Never happened before. Probably have to go back before, well, it's just never happened before. With the size of the country we've got, we're in a whole new world. How is this going to work? We're fortunate that COVID did not attack any of the critical infrastructures, but it did attack a number of the support systems that we've got to work through. And then obviously we've got the recovery capabilities that underpin bringing back our communities. And again, we think you all are right in the driver's seat for this. So you think about all those elements, and then we get into the cross-sector dependencies and coordination that I've talked about. No one sector, no one element can stand up and say, I've got this. No one's going to stand up and say, hold my beer, I figured it all out. The only way to move forward on these issues is to do it collaboratively and in a cross-sector mode. I really want to compliment our electric partners. They've been great. They're doing some cutting-edge work. I'll share some of that as we go through. But the truth is, they need support, and they're very upfront about there's certain things we can do, and there are some things that we can't do, and we need government to help us in certain areas. So just kind of a last piece on resilience considerations, because again, I see you all as kind of the keepers of the key on part of the resilience solution. There's a number of items that I'm not going to read you all on the left-hand set of bullets. One that I will call out, though, right at the top is regulation. You all have the ability to influence regulation, to help incentivize some of the efforts. And the second one there that I'll talk about is leadership. And we are seeing now across the country, both in the private sector and the public sector, a need for new types of leaders that can manage strategic risk, that they have ideas of how to put things in place so that we head off some of these cascading consequences and do it in a way where the business community can come together and support it because they know it's going to drive down the overall cost. So those are just a few of the things that followed. But again, this little graph down here in the lower right-hand corner, that carrot and the stick kind of an idea. You all have the ability to incentivize some of these actions that we'll talk about. And if I piqued your curiosity on any of these things, this was just kind of a primer, feel free to reach back out to me later and I'll plug you into some of our work groups. So let's get into the real briefing today. This is the EarthEx kickoff. EarthEx is a very large exercise, as I mentioned earlier. This is year 4. We continually have built reinforcing certain critical points in each year's exercise. When I was first brought on to help lead this effort, I thought, well, if we can get 40 or 50 organizations to play, that's going to be really good. The first year we had about 240. The second year we got up to 1,000. The third year, last year, as I mentioned, we had 1,200 registrations and over 12,000 participants. So we had some really large organizations bring in a lot of people to play. But this year's exercise is special. It's going to be available from 1 September through 31 October, and we're taking on two of the biggest human-made threats that we face today. A few things about the EarthEx concept. If you've never played EarthEx, and I know there's some people on the call that have not, this is maybe your first time getting any of this information. EarthEx is not like some other exercises. We have a sister exercise that we believe in strongly, which is called GridEx. GridEx is very much a pointed exercise. It's designed primarily for the electrical sector, but they are bringing in more cross-sector elements. But historically, GridEx has required you to do some preliminary work before you got to the exercise. EarthEx, on the other hand, is a come-as-you-are opportunity. Bring whatever you've got, bring whatever policies you've got, bring your team. You don't need to do a lot of prep work. You just need to register and then make yourself available sometime between the 1st of September and the 31st of October. I recommend playing it early because I think you're going to like this year's exercise and you may want to play it more than once. It will not be available after 31 October because we have ideas of some things we're going to do with the design. EarthEx 2020 is a widely distributed exercise event. And to do that, we built new tools that allow us to run this exercise from a centralized location in a decentralized manner. The first year we got ready to spin up EarthEx, we thought we had it all locked down. We'd announced the start date. We knew what time we were going to unleash the hyperlink for it, and basically got an email from a friend in Australia that said, hey, I've been talking to my friends, we want to play. We didn't think about Australia playing at that point in year one. So what we had to do was we had to back the start up so Australia wanted to play. The next year, Australia kicked it off again, but we literally hit many of the countries in the Far East, and then basically ran across Asia into the UK, and then moving from the East Coast to the West Coast. We had play going for almost 72 hours in that second iteration. What EarthEx is designed to do, though, unlike other exercises, is you're not going to have to turn on all your systems in your EOC or boot up your emergency ops cell. This is an exercise designed to help you conduct in-depth discussion, looking at roles and responsibilities, and primarily taking a look, especially this year, on essential decision-making and communications requirements. But for you guys in the regulatory community, a few things that try to lead you into this a little bit. As you play EarthEx, if you wear your regulatory position, you get a chance to think about policy considerations you may want to adopt or not adopt. You get a chance to take a look at some practical cybersecurity solutions that are going to seem amazingly realistic to you because we're taking them right out of the news. You're going to get a chance to think about your risks in your location. You get a chance to say, are we doing any mitigation against these risks? And possibly help with selecting some of the standards. Again, that's a cross-sector communications issue. You may conduct it in the regulatory community and then say, you know what, just like Pennsylvania did, we need to get a team together to talk about how we're going to prepare for a black sky event. The one thing I can say with great assurance after working in this field for most of my adult life, every time somebody tells me it can't happen here, sooner or later it happens to them. Or we have that figured out. Invariably, somebody tells me we've got backup communications. Well, my question is, do you have survivable backup communications? And when I add that word survivable, most people kind of turn pale. You probably don't. The good news is there are solutions that are coming to market this year where you can grab that. But depending on the threat, your communications capability could be quickly wiped out. So from the policy standpoint, the regulatory standpoint, you get a chance to look at the standards and regulations and what work's going on in your regulated companies. And then you get a chance to say, well, are there things that we could do to support the response or the restoration mission? And I can tell you from firsthand experience, having gone through a true black sky event myself with an ice storm, there are things that you can do to support the restoration mission, because it's when you start having to restore the transmission grid, you need a lot of things waived to be able to bring in the equipment, the manpower, and the trucks so that you can get in and get it done quickly. Ultimately, though, if you think about it, play the exercise and then kick back and think about, well, from a regulatory standpoint, what did it mean to us to see this preparedness issue, the mitigation issue, and then ultimately move in through that dimension of restoration? And then finally, I think you're going to see that no matter what level you're working at, you're actually one part of a cog that needs to work both lower and higher. So the local entities are going to need support. At the state level, you're going to need support from the private sector, and you're going to need to be able to support the private sector. And everybody is going to be pulling for additional information and support from either the nation or international support. So just a few things that will make this maybe a little more resonant for your community. So going back to how EarthEx works, a couple of assumptions that might be handy to put in the back of your mind. You don't need to generate a whole lot of information to play EarthEx. I mentioned it's a come as you are. Basically, all the information you need to have a great exercise will be provided to you, either in advanced email, which will be coming out, and I'll show you those dates, or actually in the exercise itself. The exercise is administered through a tool. You do need to have access to the internet, though. If you were behind a private firewalled environment, great for you, that's awesome, but you may not be able to hit these websites that we're going to use, so you may need to come up with a slightly different configuration. We actually only had that happen 2 places last year, so I think most organizations have developed a bifurcated network access capability, but you got to be able to get to the internet to be able to pull down the material. You can bring your own policies and procedures, and I actually recommend that you do that. And if you don't have them, then have a scratch piece of paper there and start taking notes, because it'll become very obvious to you as you play where you do need some policies and some procedures, especially procedures that are going to work in a black sky environment. And then this last bullet or two here, definitely you need to pick somebody to be your facilitator and or recorder. EarthEx moves quickly. You'll have the ability this year to time it out the way you want to, and we'll talk about that. But you need somebody that's got an eye on the clock, somebody that understands the flow of the exercise, and somebody that can facilitate. And then I suggest having both that person and a recorder, or maybe even a backup of both. As I said, you're going to be generating a lot of information internally from your discussions. Not a lot of writing, some writing, but not a lot. But the idea is, when it's played correctly, come fast and furious. And then finally, if you were hoping to play this exercise, and I don't know why this community would be, but I know in some of the communities that they're hopeful that we're going to do an assessment for them, an external assessment. We don't do that. We don't write an AAR for anybody. We'll facilitate you getting to where you can write an AAR, but all the assessment is internally done. So your organization assesses yourself. What we do is we publish a document at the end of the year called the roadmap. Each year is the roadmap to the next EarthEx. But what we take is the lessons learned coming out of this year's experience, listen to your recommendations, and we read every single one of your survey responses, and we use that to build the next year's exercise. As we go forward, I'll point to some places where that's actually occurred. But just keep in mind, we don't assess you. It's assessment free unless you do it. So now I'm going to get into the actual heart of the exercise. Last year, as I mentioned, we did a regional natural threat. Very unfortunate. We've got an amazing track record of kind of predicting some of these threats, but it's only because we're watching what's going on so closely. The regional threat last year was based off trying to master resource management and mutual aid. And sure enough, Iowa, Nebraska, Arkansas, part of Texas, huge flooding events, California with huge, terrible wildfires. All those things happened that met the regional threat criteria. This year's threat, because it's the end of our story arc, we're taking on, as I mentioned, 2 of the most devastating human designed threats out there. No secret, it's EMP, and it's a direct nation state cyber attack. Both of these threats are real, and both of these threats are now. They exist. There are nefarious actors that are attempting to figure out how to do this upon us and other countries like us. So we need to take the opportunity to learn these lessons today. But just as important, I think we all, from government leaders to private sector leaders to individual people, we are all responsible, and we need to ask ourselves the question, are we prepared? Because I got to tell you, with spending the last 4 years doing in-depth research into these threats, they are out there today. Some of the events that will come out of this, they're not classified. I'm scrubbing things to make sure we don't use classified information, but they're real world threats that have been unleashed on private sector companies or have been threatened by nefarious actors. So it's really not a question of if this is going to happen, it's a question of when. And we make EarthEx available so everybody can hopefully be more prepared. And I like to think people that are informed, as this crowd is, you are responsible for making sure that you and your family are prepared, as well as your organization. So kind of cool with EarthEx this year. Last year we did 38 lanes of play, and we wrote basically 38 different exercises. This year we got a little smarter, and we thought of a couple of things to make this a little bit easier on us, but we've added in some new capabilities that are going to make it extremely dynamic to play EarthEx. There are 7 functional areas that you can play. I have put a blue star by the ones that I think I would recommend this community to think about. First off, it would make me happy if every single individual and family in America and around the world played the individual and families lane. By playing that lane, thinking about your home, your family, you will be better prepared. You will answer some questions or realize that you don't have answers for questions. So if this was a military briefing and I was on the podium, I would foot stomp right now and said, at a minimum, if your organization doesn't want to play, sign up anyway, play individuals and families. That being said, this year we're allowing people to play multiple functional areas. The second one I would recommend for you all that's really prime for what you all do is government functions. But I know a number of you all are interested in the utilities that you regulate, so it wouldn't be a bad idea to play the utility functions too. And then I know I've got more than 2 or 3 people on this call that are really interested in cyber operations, and that would make another one. And there are ways you can be in one room and have each person playing those different lanes and then share what you learned, what you were fed back to them, have a great discussion. Or you can play it 4 times. There's a lot of options, but individuals and families, leaders and communities, government functions, medical, healthcare, utility, private sector and financial, cyber, all of those are the functional areas. And then we went a step further and we retain the original 38 embedded lanes. And they come into play when you see the randomized piece we'll talk about in just a minute. This is an important slide, and this is, I mentioned that we use the after action report to try to get a little bit better each year. Last year, we got a number of really great comments back about, well, I've got this type of group, or I've got this type of group. How could we play it? What could we have done better? I've already talked about individual and family, so I won't talk about that one. Let's talk about organizational structure. Most of the PUCs are what I would call centralized. You all work in the same building, you work collaboratively on a daily basis. But in case you wanted to do something in a decentralized mode, you could play this by regions across the US. One PUC playing in their boardroom while another one's playing in their boardroom, but at certain points of the exercise, you call time out and you do a teleconference or a webinar, and you go, well, what did you see at that point? What was your thought at this point? What inject did you get that you really thought you needed to do something different? This actually came from the West Coast last year. We had a very large organization, one of the biggest ones out in California, decide to play in their headquarters with their primary operating element in charge of a lot of different moving parts and pieces, but they're distributed across 6 regions. So they had each regional operator, each regional lead, the regional administrator brought his team together, and they played in that regional component. And then at predetermined times at the end of certain breakpoints, and we built those into EarthEx this year, they got together on webinars, and each group knew what they had to back brief. And that's a very realistic way that disaster response actually works. So that's the decentralized. The other one that we got some really great feedback on was a couple of what I thought was incredibly smart opportunities. They played the exercise in 2 different rooms, one group looking at operations and one group looking at resource management. And then they got back together and compared and contrasted the decisions that they made. And the feedback was amazing. They both said, well, you know what? We missed a lot by doing it in our own little silo. But then they got some things right that the other group missed. So that's an operational capability that you can do on your own. The exercise is set up for that. The last one, though, is on here, which really was a brainstorming from a group that said, hey, we tried this and we thought it worked well. They played A team, B team. So they played the people that ordinarily sit in the A position. Team 1 played the exercise, then they left the room. On another day, Team 2 showed up and Team 2 played, and then Team 1 and Team 2 back briefed, and Team 1 was able to mentor Team 2. So there's a lot of opportunities that you can do this. And the bottom line is you can do independent play. You can sign up. If your organization doesn't want to play, you can sign up by yourself and just simply play on your own. And that works well too. You'll learn a lot. You'll find that you need help though in part of it, but that's the real world. Individual and family definitely set up to be a mom and a dad or an individual using it to advance their family plan. We've been doing a number of scheduled training webinars, and I'm sorry you guys are getting this about halfway through the cycle. The good news is at the bottom of this, that link, and you'll get this in the slides that are available, that link will take you to the recordings of all these. But we started off this year's EarthEx training webinar series with a really incredible presentation by the Australian Risk Policy Institute, one of the big think tank groups that we're partnering with. A gentleman named Tony Charge presented their new concept on strategic risk policy. And then strategic risk policy goes into strategic risk management. And some of the codification of the things that we think need to be done in upcoming leaders comes out of that school of thought. That's a great organization and worldwide fellows that are all part of it. If you get a chance, you may want to listen to that one. But then I gave you a thumbnail of a thumbnail on EMP because we know most people don't know EMP. We actually conducted 2 webinars on EMP, one on EMP awareness, where does it come from? And you got a little bit of that. The second webinar, though, talks specifically about protection and hardening mechanisms. And we brought in a couple of industry leads to talk about what real world could be done. And when you all think about supporting the resiliency of some of your regulated organizations, those are some of the things that if you know what they ought to be able to do or could do, you might be able to find ways to incentivize their move. Of course, today we're doing this pitch for you, and I want to thank again Ashton for the opportunity to do this. Coming up on the 15th, we've got a world-class panel that is going to talk about today's cyber threat. I didn't put the whole title on here. It's today's cyber threat, cascading consequences, and an active defense. And we've managed to bring in an assistant undersecretary and a couple of industry leaders that are actually going to peel this back and hopefully not just scare you to death, but give you some things that you can add into your active defense to see if you are as protected as you hope you are. We're also doing one in July for people that aren't emergency managers. The concept of incident management is really foreign to them. It's interesting, I think COVID has helped us with this a little bit. Most organizations that are administrative or bureaucratic in nature aren't really cast into an emergency response role. But COVID has made people go, wait a minute, we are managing a disaster. We are part of the disaster response. And this is taking longer than a normal 48-hour, 72-hour stand up and stand down in the state EOC. So we're going to teach this course, and we're going to do our best to use it and not teach it using emergency management terminology that confuses people. So this is for non-emergency management organizations and the private sector. Then we're going to finish up with a one on global supply chain threats. We've been spending a lot of time looking at the real heartbeat issues in supply chain, more than PPE, but PPE is definitely a great example of how it can get screwed up in a heartbeat. And then global continuity issues and requirements. I'll talk a little bit more about that. I hope you guys will dial back in. But then finally, we're going to end our webinar training series as the lead up for EarthEx with the world status webinar. And that status webinar will be delivered in a manner much like War of the Worlds radio broadcast, where we will tell everybody that this is an exercise message, but we're going to talk about the state of the world getting ready to walk into EarthEx. And we will follow that up with some introductory material before the actual launch of EarthEx on 1 September. And again, that link at the bottom, if you get that link, you can get to our video wall and see all of the ones that have been recorded. A couple of important dates for those of you all that are seriously considering EarthEx. We will do initial facilitator training on the 23rd of July, so don't feel like you've missed out on anything. When we do that facilitator training, it's been extremely well received. We actually walk through the exercise as we were a facilitator and talk about ways to set the exercise up for success. I mean, you could do the exercise straight up and just play it as it comes, but what we've seen is that sometimes exercise folks fall back into old bad habits and they get to the scenario and they go, what would you do? What would you do? What would you do? EarthEx is not like that. EarthEx is set up to deliberately drive your discussion into areas that you need to learn lessons or practice. So facilitator training, very beneficial. On the 20th of August, we're going to unveil a webinar that'll likely be pre-recorded, and we'll actually play EarthEx very quickly so that people can see what it looks like. The interface for EarthEx is probably a little bit different than any exercise play you've done before. Very intuitive system. We've moved the Battle Rhythm Manager up to the Amazon cloud this year, completely retooled the interface, and I think people are going to fall in love with it because it's pretty cool. And then two big documents will come out in August, about 2 weeks before the release of the exercise. The participant workbook, which actually will have a lot of backup material in it for people that are unfamiliar with some of the issues that were. This is another survey lessons learned thing that we did. People wanted more material. We want to leave them with whatever they need. And then we'll do a very down and dirty facilitator guide that basically just highlights the points of where to stop the conversation and what you're trying to accomplish. And that'll be how to facilitate EarthEx 2020. And then that last bullet that's on the screen talks about pre-play material. So I mentioned the world status webinar. Immediately following that webinar, day 5 will come out, and day 5 is basically like an advanced newspaper, so to speak, of these are the things occurring in the world today. And each day leading up to the release of EarthEx, we will release a new set of startling events, to be honest, scary events, but we're taking all of them from real world headlines. We've been collecting these for the last couple of months. So a couple of dates to throw in the back of your mind. I'm going really quickly, but remember, you can ask questions or you can contact me afterwards. Some of our goals, we've already talked about this, EMP awareness. We don't believe most people understand the threat. Definitely cyber threat awareness. We are focusing on continuity and contingency plans. And to be honest, we know these are broken. And we want to help people figure out how to put better ones in place. COVID taught us they're broken. And then we're going to give you an opportunity, if you so desire, to be part of our global continuity structure effort. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to the commission slide. Some of our learning objectives, I'm not going to read the slide to you guys, you'll get them, but we're trying to reinforce the correct posture and the correct alignment to move through an emergency situation in a way that builds confidence that you're doing it so that you're going to accomplish your internal goals and requirements. So it starts with developing situational awareness, and then it ends with decision making and then refining decisions. And we're going to focus in on those critical missions that underpin each one of those functional areas and the lanes that you registered to play. We've chosen this year to really focus on resilience learning objectives. We think that's the direction we need to focus on as a council. Our partners agree with us. So we're really trying to get people to improve their internal planning for black sky class events. And I'm not springing anything that we don't talk about openly. The threats this year are EMP and a black sky cyber attack. What we want to do, though, is make sure that you get a chance to use those attacks to touch on your own plans for continuity and contingency. And then ultimately for us, because it's part of our mission, is to find out where you need additional training and support. So we're really going to get down right into the heart of the exercise now. And I'm going to go at a pace that I think works. We're probably going to go a little bit long, but if you have to drop off, you can watch the video. EarthEx is unlike most exercises you play because we use state-of-the-art video injects. The exercise starts with a video, we advance the play with a video, and we end the play with a video. We actually were one of the last studio shoots in Hollywood before COVID shut Hollywood down. There is going to be a workbook that we talked about. EarthEx is built into 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 will be EMP, and it'll focus on EMP awareness and preparedness. And I promise you it'll be shocking. Phase 2 is a directed cyber attack. I've played a number of different cyber themed events, and to my mind, they all kind of pussyfoot around what the real world will look like. It's pretty much coming at you from one direction, and if you solve one problem, then you can declare victory and you solve the cyber attack. Since this is on an open mic, I won't say what I'm thinking about that, but that's not real world. Real world is a directed, distributed cyber attack will absolutely take the wheels off the bus. And we're gonna set you up so you have ability to work through your capabilities, understand your vulnerabilities, and then take decisive action where you need to. And then phase 3 is a whole new animal. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's this idea of global continuity planning. And global continuity, it's not just about the globe. Global continuity planning starts at the local level, through the regional level, to the state level, to the national level, and then finally the international level. And we've got partners in a number of different nations that are helping us think through some of these issues so that they're brought to the forefront. But we'll be very interested in your feedback. If you think about EarthEx, and I mentioned we're trying to reinforce the best way to manage a disaster or emergency situation, this little flow chart, very simple, is designed to let you know how the exercise lays out. So when you get your registration link and you fire it off after the 1st of September, I guess it's the 1st of September in Australia, the link will work. The first thing that will happen is you'll be dropped in at the top of the Battle Rhythm Manager and you'll launch the opening video. That video will start your situational awareness process. And then you will establish your own situational awareness. You'll be given other materials through the application. Then you'll move into understanding risk and risk assessment. Risk is a new element for EarthEx this year. It's been part of our ARC for a while, but this year, that's the reason we brought in strategic risk policy. We think you need to think about your own risk. Then obviously what happens is, well, if this is the risk and this is the situation, what courses of action do we need to take? Once you've developed a number of courses of action, and we're going to limit the amount of time for that, you get to make a decision. All disaster response comes with making a decision or not making a decision, which, as you all know, is a decision. And then once you've done that, I'm really excited to talk to you about this next piece. Once you make your decision, you will get an advancing scenario. And at that point, you will drop into this second rectangle from the bottom down here, the one that's got the two reinforcing arrows on it. You're going to go into something that's completely unique to EarthEx. I've never seen it in any other exercise, and it's the Refining Decisions Monte Carlo game. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that is a cool factor. We're really building in gaming into the system this year. And then finally, you'll get to take a look at all that, and you'll need to determine what your final actions are. And then we close each phase with a video. So we start with a video, there's a video in the middle, and then there's an ending video. So situational awareness, I'm not going to read these to you. Obviously critically important. You've got to know what's going on. You have to understand what's happening. One thing we're trying to accomplish this year is you need to understand that these two threats can happen anytime, anywhere. They could be happening as we're talking. You need to think about understanding your risk. We're going to introduce those strategic risk management concepts. But we need you to think holistically about the elements that you're trying to support, the dependency, the assumption, the vulnerabilities, your level of exposure. And then we talked earlier about these cascading consequences. And from your standpoint as trying to do your work as a PUC or as a regulatory commissioner, where are you vulnerable? What's your personal level of risk based off cascading consequences? Things like loss of power, things like loss of potable water, things like impacts to the transportation mission. I'll give you one great example of cascading consequences. How dumb did we look like when COVID first hit and you couldn't find toilet paper? Supply chain issues are king. Just something that I'll reinforce several times. And then I did put ARPI's website down there at the bottom if you're interested. Tony Charge, great guy. I think you'll enjoy looking at their website. Then you'll get to develop courses of action. Again, we'll minimize this. I come from a military background. I ended up leading a number of pretty good sized organizations. One of the things we teach is you use all the available time you have to develop as many courses of action as possible so that you can pick from the best. In EarthEx, we don't have that kind of luxury of time. You'll have the ability to come up with a couple, and then you'll need to pick one and move out. Then you've got to go through a decision-making process. And to be honest, I don't really know what that looks like for a PUC, but hopefully your executive leadership has a process and you're able to bring the priorities and talk about the levels of coordination required and get through that gate fairly quickly. But then you get to the cool part. And this Monte Carlo piece, if you'll kind of close your eyes and vision with me, what will happen is you'll get to this particular screen in the Battle Rhythm Manager. And in the upper left-hand corner, there will be either a one-armed bandit or a slot machine, push the button, or some type of roulette wheel spin. And you'll spin it, and it'll come up with a particular response. And that response will go into your queue. And you will get the minimum number of new responses, new pieces of information you can get are 3. But if you're really feeling adventurous and you want to gamble, you can go for 10, up to 10. Each one of those is designed to make you rethink what happens to your original decision. Now, the reason we're doing that is because so many exercises are like baking a cake. get the pan out, grease the pan, grab the eggs, grab the mix it all together, put it in the oven, and you're done. Real disasters are not like that. Real disasters are you do the best you can to come up with a plan, make the decision that supports the plan, and then you've got to be constantly looking for things that change in the environment that will make you change your plan. And that's the reason we've built this gaming system called Monte Carlo in here. If you're a programmer by trade, you'll recognize that Monte Carlo name. That's an early on programming convention. If you're a gambler, you know about Monte Carlo, the really cool place to go and visit. Some of the things really, these are just kind of highlights, but when you start making your initial decisions, there's some things that have to happen. And if you're not the decision maker, you can step back and evaluate your decision maker and your leader on some of these points. Are they trying to make sense out of what's going on in the real world, or are they distracted by something that's not important? Are they trying to coordinate the implementation of that decision, or are they just making a decision from on high and hoping everybody else understood what they were talking about? Really great leaders are trying to get as much information as they can, factor that into the decision, and then make the decision make sense to those that have to go and implement it or understand it. And then ultimately, from a decision-making standpoint, and definitely from a leader standpoint, and this is definitely something in the PUC's playbook, is this accounting and the ending. Everything comes to an end at some point, and have you done it in a way where you can track where costs and expenses and metric results were achieved? So it's one of those things to think about. And then ultimately, you'll figure out that the number one thing that has to happen to be successful in any kind of a crisis is communication. Are we effectively communicating with everybody? And everybody is not used lightly. It really does mean everybody. One of the ones I put in for a lot of our practitioners in the emergency management community or senior executive class that's got this briefing, to do this, you're going to have to make some tough decisions. EarthEx is not a lightweight, easy exercise. It's putting you into some pretty dire situations because that's the only way to learn. And the whole idea is to learn virtually before you have to learn real world. Some of the things, though, when you make those decisions is understand what your gut instincts are. And if your gut instincts are bounded by knowledge, experience, a backup of additional information, you should trust your gut instincts probably most all the time. But you got to make those decisions with confidence. You need to understand when you need to adjust, and that's why the refinement phase was put into this. You also need to know how to delegate. If you decide to play as a big group, one of the things that you can do is you can delegate some of the injects to different groups and let them work it up and then back brief. And then finally, once you make a decision, you got to apply it and see what was the impact. Ultimately, one of the things we're trying to teach people, and we do it through some of our resilience metrics efforts, is to have key metrics so you can measure whether you're actually having the kind of impact that you want to have. And then one of my final slides that I've added in here since doing a number of the planning sessions with groups that have helped us is to make sure everybody understands that we're trying to make this as realistic as possible, and that sometimes, even though you've done perfectly, you're still going to suffer significant losses. Why does that happen? Well, sometimes you don't have enough time. As I mentioned in courses of action, you'd like to have a couple of days to build those out. You won't have time for that. Sometimes you have to take the initial step. You may not have all the expertise on your team. With EarthEx Phase 2, if you have no one that knows anything about cyber, you will be able to complete the exercise, but you may be baffled by some of the issues. Vice versa, Phase 1 EMP, if all you've ever gotten is at least that little piece I gave, you'll know a little bit about what EMP is, but you might have some issues about, well, what can we do from a resilience standpoint? Collaboration, a lack of collaboration and not working with your cross-sector partners. Obviously, communications is an issue. Sometimes you can be in a disaster that's so big, there is no win. And I kind of put COVID in that issue. There are things, obviously, I think we all know we could have done better, but the fact that the virus got out and the virus attacked people, once that had happened, that was going to continue on a trend line. So there are some things that you just can't do anything about that. One of the ones I always try to stomp down is this idea that it can't happen here. The US has never been attacked before. We don't need to worry about it. Well, that's just flat wrong. And that just shows a lack of understanding of history. To be quite candid with you, the United States on our own turf today is under attack at this moment. All you need to do is see one of the attack vector software widgets, It shows you the number of malicious software attacks that are happening, cyber attacks that are happening, and you realize we're under attack right now. We just got a pretty good security system at this point in most places, but not all. And then finally, this whole idea of paralysis, where it's just so overwhelming, you just don't know what to do. And I'll take 2 seconds to tell you this quick story. When we first launched Black Sky, we didn't really know who all would sign up to play. And we were really happy that we saw a bunch of people playing from the health and medical community. And then we realized that a large number of our players were actually long-term care facilities and nursing homes. And so through the course of that, we got some really great feedback and some very heartfelt messaging from some administrators who said, you know, you blew our socks off. When you said the power was out and we couldn't communicate, we didn't know what to do. Well, last year, after playing 2 years back to back, I got the nicest email from one of these ladies. She said, I want you to know this year we knew what to do. We had improved our plans. We knew what we were supposed to do. And so we're better now. And she was very thankful for EarthEx. I'm not telling you you're all going to write me a nice letter when this is over. What I want to tell you is, though, that you can overcome this paralysis of not knowing what to do by doing things like EarthEx. So getting close to the end here for those of you all that are concerned. The third phase of EarthEx is this concept of global continuity that we want to try to help move forward. And we've been giving this a lot of thought since we came back from London and Glasgow last year. We're fortunate to have some really great players at some pretty high levels. And when they talk about the fact that they can't do some of their mission and there aren't solutions in place, that starts pointing to us to certain things that multiple groups need to start advancing the dialogue and helping to shine bright lights. Phase 3 is what we're going to do. And to be honest, I originally wrote phase 3 back in November. I normally start writing EarthEx about a month after it ends. And we got to about March, and I was watching what was happening with COVID. And I said, you know, we're going to change phase 3. We're going to change the questions in phase 3. And we're going to allow everybody to be part of probably the world's largest after action review on what we've learned as a group, individuals and as a group coming out of COVID. And that's going to be this government continuity plan. To do that, we're launching late this summer, the Resilience Commission. And it is a commission much like the council. We're going to use a number of very high level people that are partners of ours. And we're going to conduct 3 inaugural inclusive webinars. You'll be able to sign up for these webinars if you're interested. We're going to have panel experts talk about certain pointed elements that are part of what we think the resilience framework. The goal for the resilience framework, though, is to begin to put to it practical resilience objectives. And those objectives, we're kind of setting the gate. They need to be something that can be implemented in a 12 to 18 month time frame. And again, it's open to everybody. If you're interested in this, I'm not going to take us down that rabbit hole today. Go ahead and register for EarthEx, because the people that register for EarthEx are going to get access to all this information. And I think, having worked with a number of the PUCs and definitely the NARUC staff, I think you guys would make outstanding additions to this effort. Some of the continuity areas, though, when I talk about that we're looking at, I mentioned leadership, specifically in decision-making and strategic risk. But then some of the areas that, to be honest, have not been pulled apart yet, like supply chain issues. We've been doing work on software and component supply chain issues, but now I think we need to pull the whole thing apart. There have been a number of cyber attacks that basically have completely shut down our shipping capability, really destroyed for a period of months at a loss of great economic impact to some of our manufacturing sectors here in the US. By a cyber attack coming out of Russia 2 years ago. The one that I like to foot stomp on here is the definition of essential worker status. I've read more continuity and contingency plans than most people, and absolutely none of them that I saw up until probably April ever talked about that the grocery store clerk that stocked the shelves was an essential worker. But by golly, we found out that if that guy doesn't stock the shelves, we don't eat. You'll notice on here a couple of the ones that I think you will be very interested in: information sharing, and then also the concepts for what information you share, whether you have confidence in it. And then the one that COVID really pointed a big bright spotlight on was this idea of alert, notice, and assessment. We've got to get better at when something is breaking and it has the ability to break across a locality, a region, or nation states that we all have eyes on it and we understand what's going on. So just in summary, a few things, some important dates. You'll get these. I'm not going to read them. I left this slide in here. Hopefully you're going to, if you haven't registered for EarthEx, you will. Hopefully you'll get some other people to register too. This slide, these dates are important so you can do well at the exercise. And then this is kind of humorous, but the second most asked question after 3 years of doing this, the second most asked question is, how do I get my certificate? Normally starts coming in about an hour and a half after we launch the exercise. Basically, you've got to complete phase 3. So you can't skip any of the phases. You don't have to do great at them, but you've got to complete them. We will then send to whoever registered the link. That link then needs to get distributed to everybody that played with you. Everybody that plays can register if they want. I actually recommend that. But if you're registering for your organization and you're signing up 12 people, then when you get the link, you share it. Send that link to them. They'll complete the survey. We'll collect their information, their feedback, and then almost immediately you'll receive a certificate by email suitable for framing, or more important, maybe suitable for continuing education credits. Though finally, the most asked question about EarthEx, even though we talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, is what time does the exercise start? And the bottom line, so you all know, is you pick your own start time and date. The exercise will be available as soon as it turns 1 September somewhere on Earth. And from that point, the link is live. You use the link that you got in the mail and you can start it up. My recommendation, if I was doing it in a perfect world, I'd look at the calendar where it didn't look like I was going to have people distracted. I'd pick that as my calendar date. When I got my, when the world status webinar came out, I'd link that video site so that I could use that 5 days before. Then as I got my lead up information coming in, I'd hold it and then I'd send it to my team so they get kind of a realistic building of expectations. And then when everybody shows up in the room for the exercise, all you need to do is have a computer that's connected up to a great audio visual system. Definitely you want cool speakers and a nice visual big screen if you can. The sound on this is normally awesome. Again, this is Hollywood production values. And then sit back and do the exercise. One of the things we didn't talk about was this year's exercise, we've modified it. You can play it. If you have a small group of people, you can probably play phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 in 4 hours. But when I say small group of people, 3 to 4. If you have more than that, then you're probably going to want to schedule a day because you're going to want to have robust discussions as you go through. At least I hope you do. And then we were asked by some people, said, well, you know, the way we work, we can't take off whole days. So my recommendation to them is on day 1, do phase 1. On day 2, come in and pick up with phase 2. On day 3, come back and do phase 3. And do 4 hours on each or whatever you need to do them, and then let people go back to their desk. However you want to play it this year, we've made it so that the exercise will let you stop play and then pick it right back up where you left off. So we think that's doing as well as we possibly can. Obviously, if we were sitting in your room facilitating for you, we'd have a lot of flexibility. But when you start talking about 12,000 people around the globe playing, we had to make some concessions. And this is the last slide. If you have any questions at all about EarthEx, feel free to send me an email at earthex@eiscouncil.org. We are a .org shop, and I have a team of people that will answer those very quickly. If you don't know how to register, there's the registration link. The kind of cool thing, though, is after 3 years of doing EarthEx, if you go to Google and just type in EarthEx and you spell it correctly, the first thing that comes up at the top of the list is EarthEx, which is our site. That site has a countdown clock. You click on the link there, and it'll take you to the actual registration site, and you just give us some information. Email is the key for your information, and then you pick what lane, functional area you want to play, and you're off to the races. So my last thing is, what you can do to help us is invite your friends and your family and others in your network. I would really love to see dots in every single map, every single state this year. We got every state in the U.S. except one. And we understood why that one didn't. They were coming off 4 months of back-to-back disasters. Unfortunately, this year we've got a bit of a distraction with COVID, and if things don't change, some of us will still be fighting COVID. But as my exercise lead likes to tell me, sir, this is absolutely the safest exercise you can play this year because you can do it virtually. It's all online. You don't have to get together in a group. So that opportunity is there. But the bottom line is, if you go back, I think we owe it to fellow man to help them be prepared. So do all you can, get people to register. And that's my last slide. So Ashton, I don't know if you got any questions. I know I'm probably over on time. Yeah, a little bit. Sorry about that, but I wanted to get you the EMP material. But I'll turn it back over to Ashton. Thank you again for the opportunity. If you have any questions, I'll hang on and answer them. And not, I'll just give it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us. And I would like to open it up at this time. If anybody has a question, feel free to use the raise your hand tool within the dashboard, or you can chat a question and I can ask it to John myself. But in the meantime, John, I was going to ask you a question myself. You mentioned that this can be played completely virtually. And are there any special tools that an organization would need to be able to play it completely virtually?
No, not really. Let's use two scenarios. So if you're playing individual or family, or you're playing one of the other functional areas, you just have to have access to the internet. And so you'll go to that website and it'll just be one window. So if you wanted to run a team telecommunications webinar on the side, bounce back and forth between windows, you'd be able to do that. We use state-of-the-art programming tools. So if you can open a browser window and you're using a modern browser, I'll give you a funny story. 2 years ago, we were excited. We got one of the major banks in England to play, and we kicked it off in the UK. And the guy wrote and he said, "I don't understand. It's not working. What did you guys do?" And of course, we're like, "What do you mean? We didn't do anything." So we're fighting through it. And finally, I said, "Hey, let me ask you a couple of questions. Where are you that you're doing this? Is this a good Wi-Fi connection?" He goes, "Oh, absolutely. This is our business Wi-Fi." "Okay, great. Are you in a boardroom?" He goes, yeah, we're in our major boardroom. We got like 50 people in here. I said, "Okay, great. Let's talk about your computer. What browser are you using?" "Oh, we're using Internet Explorer." So I asked him what version. The version was a little dated, but we had used it. I said, "Well, what box are you using it on?" He goes, "Well, it's a Windows NT box." If you go back that far in technology, we probably can't support you. Windows NT had already been not used by Windows for about 10 years at that point. So close to 10 years. So anyway, use a modern computer, use a standard open browser. I do all my work on Chrome, but we do test it on Safari, on an iPad, and we will test it in the new version of Microsoft's browser. So a standard browser should work.
Great. Well, hopefully everybody's got some updated laptops. And John, I'm not seeing any questions pop up here or hands raised. So it sounds like you proactively answered all of them.
Well, I doubt that, but people are shy and it's getting close to the end of the week. So, hey guys, again, if I can help you with anything or you need any other questions, you've got my email. If something doesn't work and you don't get to me, Ashton and I are talking on a fairly regular basis these days. I'm sure he wouldn't mind relaying, but thanks again for the opportunity. And it's been great working with the NARUC community one more time.
Well, thanks, John. Yeah, I will send out a PDF version of the PowerPoint to everybody that's joined the call. And now we can just consider the webinar complete. Thank you everyone so much.